So we're looking at chapter 15.3 through 15.5. The thing that these all have in common is that they're dealing with biomes. Now, biomes are the highest level before the biosphere. So it goes organism, population, community, ecosystem, then biome. And so the biomes are going to be the biggest areas that include many ecosystems together. Now, the highest is the biosphere, which is what's including everything, but this is the second highest. So we're going to be looking at, okay, what are the major land biomes? How are they distinguished? What's happening with those? So with a biome, biomes are areas that have similar ecosystems, and they're basically classified by several things. So they have some abiotic, some biotic. So some abiotic things they're classified by would be their climate. So that would mean their precipitation and their temperature. Other things that could fall under the abiotic would also be soil type. Some have more fertile soil than others, and therefore more organisms can live there. So then that brings us to the biotic. Okay, biotic, remember, those are the living features. So the things that are going to separate them are the types of organisms. So that would be types of animals and plants. So then in the picture here, you can see a lot of the different areas. Each color represents one type of a biome versus another. Now, if we look at where we're at, okay, we're around here-ish, and that's going to be the temperate areas. But you also have other areas. So the big, depending on where they're at, if you look at like the latitude, a lot of the big areas are going to be similar throughout that entire latitude. So for instance, if you look at the pink there, the pink is your desert. So basically everything around here, you have more of the same kind of desert for all of them. Or in the lower ecosystem, you have more of the deserts. Now there are some other things sprinkled in there, but that latitude does tend to have the similar features. All right, so if we look at our biomes here, we have a lot of very different types. So we have everything from tropical rainforest, tropical dry forest, desert, temperate grassland, so forth. So a lot of them are separated based on their latitude, so where they're at in comparison to the equator. So the tropical ones are going to be closer to the equator, temperate are going to be that tweener area, and then the tundra and your boreal forests are going to be closer to the polar regions. Now there are four main biomes that we look at, and those are the ones that are bolded. And that's because these ones are the most important in terms of differences. So tropical rainforest, for instance, if you look at it, the key term there is rain. This is the wettest biome. They get over 200 inches of rain a year. Now it's tropical, so it's also super hot here. So the climate is very warm temperatures. Now these warm temperatures basically last all year round. So they're not going to get very much below, say, 60 degrees like ever. Usually it's going to stay in the 70s to the 90s in there. Now if you look at the desert, okay, the desert is also extremely warm. However, the desert is very dry, and it's going to actually get less than 10 inches of rain a year. Now the temperate forest, the only reason why this one is on here is because that's where we live. And so with the temperate forest, it's going to have a more moderate climate. So it's going to get hot, it's going to get cold. We're going to have those seasons that we deal with around here. So we're going to have the winters, and then we're also going to wind up with summer, and then there will be spring and fall that are a little more moderate. Now as for the temperature, we get about 200 inches a year. So we have a good amount of rain, but it's still less than the rainforest. And then the last one we're going to look at is the tundra. So the tundra is kind of like the dry desert, but it's a polar desert. It's a cold one. So it is considered a cold desert. So this has very cold temperatures. You're talking it's around freezing most of the time. It's also going to be dry, like I said. So it also gets less than 10 inches of rain a year. Now, because it's cold, it also gets something called permafrost. Now the name basically gives it away. Perma as in permanent. It is permanently frozen there. You're not going to be able to thaw out ever. All right, now there are a few areas that cannot actually be put into a biome. They don't fit right. And the main reason why they don't fit correctly in one or the other is because they don't have typical plants or animals. They don't always stay the same. One reason for that, if we look at the first example, is we're looking at mountain ranges. Well, they change with elevation. So depending on where you're at on a mountain, if you've ever dealt with a mountain or climbed it, as you go up, it gets colder. It also winds up getting a lot harder to breathe. The air is more thin. So different types of organisms will live at the bottom than they do at the top, because the bottom, if you like look in your picture here, the bottom is very grassy. Okay, it's going to be a lot nicer place to live, whereas the top is barren or snow covered because it is getting so cold. So you're going to get different organisms in each. Now with the polar ice caps also are not considered a biome, even though they do fit the issue of being cold and they're cold all year round. They don't work because the organisms are constantly moving. The organisms don't stay there. Most of the organisms that are on a polar ice cap are really ocean animals. Or they're organisms that came from the tundra. So a lot of animals would be like the seals. Seals are more of an ocean creature and they just stay on the ice caps when they need to. Or polar bears. Polar bears are usually in the tundra, but they stop by. So those were the main land biomes, and then a few that don't really fit into one category or another. So now we're going to move on to the water. Now we're going to start with marine ecosystems. Now remember, marine ecosystems, that's just another term for the ocean. Now the ocean is a pretty large place, so there's going to be a lot of differences as we go through there. So we're going to talk about what are some of the factors that will affect it and how are they different in different areas. So with our marine ecosystem, it's going to be separated based on a couple of factors. Okay, the first one is going to be depth, and then the second will be distance from the shore. Now, if we look at the distance from the shore first, we have what's called the intertidal zone, which means literally between tides. This is the area that when you have high tide, it's underwater. Excuse me. Whereas at low tide, it's going to be above the surface of the water. Now, because of the fact that it keeps constantly changing between below water, above water, the organisms here are very tolerant. They can basically manage to withstand extreme salinity, extreme water, extreme sunlight, all of those things. So you have to have some pretty awesome organisms living there. And so what happens is the intertidal zone really doesn't have that many organisms in comparison to the rest of them because it's such a harsh place to kind of live. Now, if we look at depth, okay, with the depth here, we have the photic and the aphotic zone. Photo means light. So the photic zone literally means the light zone. This is where sunlight penetrates. Now, sunlight will only penetrate down to 200 meters. Below that, there is no sun, so it starts getting murkier and murkier until it eventually becomes pitch black. Now, because this is where the sunlight is, this is where photosynthesis happens. And so that means most of your life is going to be in that photic zone because photosynthesis is what's bringing in the energy. Now, aphotic, photic meant light, A means non or without, so this is basically the without light zone. Or in other words, it's always dark. Now, because it's dark, it's also going to be cold. And then as you keep going down, because this one goes from 200 meters and below, it also winds up getting high pressure here. And so what happens is organisms that live in the aphotic zone have to be able to be adapted to the dark, the cold, and the high pressure. So if we look at our picture over here on the right, you have an anglerfish in this picture. From In this case, it's an example from Finding Nemo. Now with this anglerfish, it is built for the dark. Okay, it has the little light to attract other fish so that it winds up getting food. Now it itself does not need the light. It is blind. But with this, it's also regulated to that high pressure. If you tried to bring an anglerfish to the surface of the ocean and you wanted to take it home as a pet, it would literally explode, because what happens is the anglerfish gets so used to the pressure, its body is adapted for that. When it comes to pressure, you push back on the surrounding area with as much force as it pushes on you. So say the ocean was pushing back on you with over 1,000 pounds of pressure, you're pushing on it with 1,000 pounds of pressure. Well, if you take that anglerfish to, say, the surface, let's say it's only pushing back with 100 pounds of pressure, it's still pushing back with 1,000 pounds of pressure. So it will explode potentially unless you bring it up very, very slowly. This is the same reason why divers, if they go down too deep too fast, they'll get the bends, and then when they come back up type thing. And that's because the pressure changes change too quickly. So if we were to take something from the surface down to the bottom of the ocean without any protection, it would implode. All right, so then if we look more so at the distance from the shore. So we already looked at the intertidal zone. Now the intertidal is then followed with the neritic. Now the neritic is kind of different. It's kind of a little bit everywhere. Okay, it's kind of from the shore to your continental shelf, basically. And so it's including the intertidal. It's this region, whereas your intertidal is basically that part. And so with the neritic, this one's going to be where the majority of photosynthesis is. So this is going to be where the most biomass is, or the most life. So this is the most populated area in the ocean. So you're going to get coral reefs here and all the different organisms from that and those different things. The next level is going to be the bathal zone, which is here. Okay, with the bathal zone, this one is below the neritic and it goes down through the continental shelf partially. This area tends to be murky. Now it's murky water because it has a very high salt concentration. And because we are going lower into the ocean, this one is going to be higher pressure. Now it is getting darker at this point. It's not completely pitch black yet though. It's just kind of, like I said, murky. But then you get to the abyssal zone. And the abyssal zone is here. The abyssal zone is basically on its way to the bottom of the ocean. It's not the complete bottom because there are a few other areas that are lower, like in the deep sea trenches, but this is basically mostly all the way down. So this is going to be where it's completely dark. It's going to be extremely cold, and it's going to have the highest pressure down here. So the bathal is still pretty cold, higher pressure in that, but it's not as bad as the abyssal. Picture the abyssal, it's the abyss. It's the end of everything. Okay, so that's the marine life. So then we move on to the freshwater ecosystems. Now freshwater means there's no salt. So we're going to be looking at them. We have some that stands and we have some that's moving. So with our freshwater ecosystems, we're going to be using several conditions to explain these. So one is definitely depth. Okay, another thing is going to be your temperature. As you go down in any body of water, it does start getting colder. So depth, temperature. You're also going to be looking at dissolved nutrients. So dissolved nutrients could include things like oxygen or carbon dioxide, but it's also things like phosphorus and nitrogen. which phosphorus and nitrogen tend to be very lacking in these types of areas. And then the other type we're going to look at is movement, so flow. Does it flow or not? So we get to our freshwater. Now we're still looking at depth. Now with the depth, we have the photic and aphotic again, which is basically the same. So photic is the light zone. So it extends again to 200 meters. Now for a lot of different freshwater systems, the entire thing is photic. There is no dark place. The aphotic is again the dark or the non-light zone, and it would be below the 200 meters. But this one we have the benthic zone. Okay, benthic, think bottom. This is basically your soil and sediment that's at the bottom of these features. And so with this, the benthic zone is actually a big area for a lot of underwater creatures. In this case, because you get like crawfish and different other invertebrates and bugs that are living within the actual soil and sediment down there. All right, now as for types of freshwater ecosystems, like I said, it's based on whether it flows or whether it stands still. So if it's flowing, examples of that would be rivers, streams, and then when it's flowing water, what happens is there's very little plant life. And the reason for that is that when the water is moving, they can't put down roots. So what happens is they basically get pulled along, and so there's not a lot of time for them to build those root systems to stand strong. So they get ripped out basically. But there are a lot of nutrients. Now, part of the reason why there's a lot of nutrients is because you get flooding and things like that. You do get all those different plants and things getting washed down the river, so there's a lot in them there. Now, if we have still or stagnant water, that's going to be ponds and lakes. Now, these do tend to have a lot of plant life. And that's because they are so still, they don't have to worry about having their roots ripped out. They're always attached to the bottom. These are also going to have lots of nutrients. Now, the reason why these have lots of nutrients is because when anything dies, it just stays there. It falls down inside of it, and it just is accessible to everyone. So with the river, it's a little more so because of the plant life that gets ripped out or even runoff from fields and things like that, whereas in the case of the still water, it's because they're always growing there. So those are our main sectors. Now we also get what are called wetlands. Wetlands are also considered fresh water. There are a few examples would be marshes or bogs. Now these are places where the water is basically at the surface. Or it's at least pretty close to it. So in some of them you have standing water, depending on how extreme your wetland is. Now these are important because of a couple of reasons. The first reason is they help remove pollutants. So whenever there's something in the water system, these will actually take it out. And I know it may seem weird, another importance is that it helps prevent flooding. Now you might be wondering, okay, how can these prevent flooding when they're already underwater? Well, the idea is that water from other places around the wetlands will get filtered here. And then because this has such an absorbent soil type, it'll get sucked in and you don't have to worry about it. So wetlands are actually extremely important. All right, and then our last type is an estuary. Now this is where a river meets your sea or your ocean. So it's the idea, it's the mixture of fresh and salt water. So estuaries really don't have a category. They're kind of their own separate thing because they don't fall into fresh water because there's too much salt, but they're not as salty as the ocean. Now, the reason why these are important is because they're great for laying eggs. They're a great hatchery, basically. And the reason why is if you're an ocean fish, the ocean's a big, scary place. There's lots of predators, things that are going to eat you. But if you go into a river, it's a little safer. But if you go too far up in the river, you die. Because remember, they are used to salt, whereas rivers are freshwater. So that would be one way they would die because homeostasis wouldn't be maintained. So by going to an estuary where it's kind of a tweener zone, it's a lot more safe because there's less predators there, so they can lay their eggs without having harm. And then it still has the salt water that's going to help keep them alive. And because these are great fish hatcheries in egg laying areas, these wind up being great for fishing because the fish industry in this case doesn't even have to go anywhere to get fish. They're all laid out right in front of them. So it winds up being a very important part for the fish industry as well as for the actual habitats. All right, so this concludes chapter 15. Make sure if you're not getting stuff, go back and rewatch the video.